do slide. Okay. Can you see all these slides, folks? Yeah. So I think I did most of these things on the train back from Brussels, and then started adding more this morning that I thought needed. And then I looked at the timetable and thought 20 minutes. Maybe I'm going to have to be a little bit careful about how I manage the presentation part of this. So I'm gonna. So I don't know how we share. I probably will share these online in a way, but they're certainly available to anybody in the group who wants them afterwards, because there's probably a bit too much detail on some of it. The main thing to say is just to distinguish really almost two phases. So we're going to talk about community mapping, but it may be disappointing to find that the primary purpose of the initial work was to actually just define the communities, and I'll explain why that's so important. And I think what we did was very interesting and has had a positive impact, but it's not the same as defining what's in the community, if you see what I mean. So the second phase of the project is about helping people define what's in the project. The first phase was actually defining the communities that could then do the second phase. So, and the reason that that is important is particularly to do with the peculiarities of English local government, and particularly in the context of Sheffield. So there's just this work really has been created by Citizen Network, which is the organisation which I, Marcus, John's part of. A Fair Society's joined. You're all welcome to join. We're working for a world where everyone matters, and we've been in existence since 2016. And we believe that kind of the power of citizenship is the power that can help restore some sanity to the world and battle the enormous crises we face. So this very briefly is a bit of the context here. Actually, the work that I'm going to describe, I suppose I first started to think about in 2016, which shows that sometimes that things sometimes take a long time for whatever reason. I started thinking about this partially because of austerity, having spent a lot of the period from 2010 to 2015 campaigning against austerity, researching austerity, showing how unfair it was. My lesson was, oh, nobody cares because democracy doesn't work. So I started to ask myself a question less about social policy and public services and public spending, but what are the democratic structures that underpin society? And so this led to this debate, this event we ran in as part of the 2016 Festival Debate, Is Sheffield a Democracy? And I started thinking about the peculiarities of Sheffield. It's got a population of over 500,000, which is the same size as the country Suriname, twice the size of the country Iceland. English government is hyper centralized. Local government has very few powers, very little economic power, and no constitutional protections. And sorry, I can't even read my own slides here because I can't move around them. Have I just broken the link, or is it still sharing? Good.
Yeah.
So the in Sheffield itself, there actually was no map of the neighbourhoods of Sheffield. And then, of course, we had COVID, which really showed many people more, I think, the power of the local. So these are just slides which I'll just flick through. I sometimes just to make the point, really, that a city like Sheffield is, in global terms, the size of many countries. There are many countries smaller than Sheffield, and yet Sheffield doesn't behave like it's a country. And the chart on the right shows how weird England is. So this is actually the average size of municipal government around Europe compared to the pink column on the right is England, and the blue column on the far right is Sheffield. So in other words, local government is incredibly big in terms of population, even though it's incredibly weak in terms of spending. So this is data from another report, which is about Barnsley, And here you can see that Barnsley, in its own community, controls 11% of public spending. And there are other questions which I'm going to skip over, which are interesting about that as well. And here, like for our purposes, this is just to try and ground. So again, this we're not all from England here, but in England, it's quite typical that nobody in the room, even if you're talking to middle class people or people in politics, people actually have very little knowledge about how other systems work. So comparing Sheffield to Iceland is a way of dramatizing the radical differences in the state of our democratic structures. So again, just picking out a couple of things. Iceland has a constitution, full economic system, and democratic system, and it has 74 municipalities, which in size terms would be equivalent to 120 in Sheffield. And those municipalities control kindergartens, primary school, waste management, social services, public housing, public transport, services to senior citizens and to disabled people. So what would be for us a neighbourhood is in Iceland a unit of extreme devolved power with significant economic resources and the ability to shape things for local people and with local people. Again, another point of contrast, ancient Athens, just in terms of democracy, what we see, again, people don't tend to know that Athenian democracy was built on 140 demis, which were basically democratic units of a democratic neighborhood unit. And that's where a lot of the democratic action actually takes place. And again, demis were responsible for things like educating the young. So Athens itself was again about half the size of Sheffield at its peak, but within that were very small units where people met together to make decisions. So that was the basic premise, which was that, if we're going to be serious about democracy, then we need to be serious about neighborhoods and the scale at which things work. Here's a picture of Sheffield. Sheffield has 84 councillors elected from 28 wards, but the wards themselves have no participative structures, no engagement structures. Very recently, Sheffield invented something called the local area committee process, which creates 7 areas for the whole city. So again, you can see that's going to be an average population of about 80 to 90,000 people. And that's an attempt, and these are meetings that are quarterly, which are very traditional in structure, at least the ones I participated in. They're not really structures for any kind of participative discussion. They are really consultation sessions between the councillors from the relevant wards and whichever local people find out about this and turn up. And in my experience, it was mostly a kind of dysfunctional place for people to air grievances about the failures of the public services. The thing about Sheffield is, though, I'm sure this is true of many other places, but this is the place I've lived for the last 20 years. People here know what neighbourhood they live in, but there is no official map of those neighbourhoods. Again, this slide's just, I think, things people know. If you want to do community development, if you want to make communities better, you operate at that scale. And this slide goes back to work we did during COVID, which again shows that in the response to a crisis like COVID, actually having hyper-devolved structures is incredibly useful. And this work in a way mirrors, I think, the lessons that Joseph Rathenham teaches us about the neighbourhood parliaments. You need to get down to very small scale. In fact, neighbourhoods themselves, you would want to break up into smaller communities. And so cutting to the end in a way, this is the final output. Well, not quite final because the process is also ongoing, but you can see on the 17th of May, we published a map of 147 neighbourhoods. And then somebody reminded me that 147, I think, is the maximum break you can have in snooker. So as Sheffield is the home of snooker, that seems very apposite, but that wasn't the plan. But it seems quite serendipitous. Oh, sorry. So what did we do to get to that point? Well, first of all, we purchased a license from Maptionaire. I was very interested, given that I was not making any progress in getting a kind of official process underway to define the neighbourhoods of Sheffield, I thought, what would it be like if we just created a citizen-led process? And the best technology that I had discovered was this one called Maptionaire, which is actually a Finnish company, but it's used worldwide, particularly by local government, to do work with citizens around often neighbourhood planning and participative budgeting. So we bought a license from Maptionaire, and that allowed us to run a survey. We also got some funding from NHS Sheffield. We have some very good leadership in NHS Sheffield, people who really understand the importance of community and were interested in my argument that defining the neighbourhoods of Sheffield would be helpful for the long-term strategy in Sheffield. We partnered up with Tom French, Data for Action, who did a lot of the technical details in terms of running the survey and managing the data. Mostly we use social media to reach out to people. We also got good response from 3 of the kind of Sheffield media, to the main newspaper, The Star, and 2 of the digital magazines covered it. And we left this survey open and it spread virally. We ran some workshops, including several workshops in some of the disadvantaged communities where we suspected engagement with a digital mapping tool would be low. We spoke to the city leadership team, the chief executive, and her team. And again, although there was no official sanction for this work, interestingly, it felt like we were touching a nerve. And I mean, there's a long-term context for that, but I won't go into that here. But I think there are a lot of the officials within the council who would like to see some kind of change in this direction, but the politics of making it happen are challenging. We shared, I think, importantly, one of the things, and this is down to Tom, as we discovered stuff, we shared it as we discovered it. So this is very much a kind of just open project done in partnership with the community. We reached out through, there are a lot of Facebook groups, neighborhood Facebook groups, so we reached out to those to also extend. So 1,000 or so people completed the survey. Actually, I haven't checked. I should have checked that data with Tom before, but it is over 1,000 people. And actually 500 or so people said, we want to carry on working with you if you come back to us. And we put all of those things into a map, which itself people can leave comments on. And so all the links to these are kind of available if you go to the Citizen Network website where we share the output. Now, at the moment, my short-term issue is really about building some kind of legitimacy for this work. So like we've had further meetings with the council, we're feeding it into different things. We're getting support, but also worries. So we can talk a little bit about this. The methodology of the survey itself basically allowed people to do several things. People could look at the map of Sheffield and they could draw what they thought their neighbourhood was on it and name it. We also asked other questions, but they're secondary for this purpose. We also shared we did discover in the process of getting ready to launch it that the council had a map of the neighbourhoods of Sheffield. There were fewer neighbourhoods than we thought there were on their map, but it was still a good starting point. They just had never published the map, which again speaks to some of the underlying challenges. And we also shared a long list of neighbourhood names, which actually I got from the internet from somebody who was a kind of citizen geographer cyclist. He'd gone around doing just asking people what neighborhood they were from. And so he'd come up with a list of about 135 in about a year or so before that talk I gave. So basically the list grew, as we'll see, from about 135 to 147 as we went through this process. Tom took the data, fine-tuned it, we published it, and we now have a database of people which we will set up through our Action Network system so we can regularly reach out to people and then grow the numbers of people who want to do this work. These are some of the issues. And some people think we shouldn't have clear boundaries, we should have fuzzy boundaries. And there's a logic to that. I tend to contest that. I can tend to say, well, it's better that we kind of mark the map because part of the duties of citizens is to take responsibility for the whole community. So the fact that some part of your community might be something you don't think is your community or some doesn't seem to me helpful. So we don't want to have kind of black spots where nobody's taking responsibility. So that be my slightly deontological hang-ups. But I also think there's a really interesting case for thinking about things like parks and roads and business areas as obviously they're broad community assets for everybody, but there could be some joint stewardship. Say, so if a river, for instance, the neighbourhood could have a responsibility for part of that river, but as part of a community of people who are all taking care of that river. Clearly, there are anxieties about the way in which this might create neighbourhood power. So for you, for me, that's not our anxiety. But that is the reality within which we're doing this work, that there are people with power who feel that these kind of these kind of emerging patterns might erode their power. I think they're wrong because I don't think power is that kind of thing. But it does require change on their part, and so that's part of the challenge. There have been in Sheffield, which is we don't have any Conservative councillors in Sheffield, I'm proud to say. It's Labour, Green, Lib Dem. Um, a lot of concerns from the kind of centre left of how neighbourhood power might increase inequality. Again, I think that concern is misconceived, but is reasonable and requires addressing. The thing that I think has popped up as we've done this work, sorry, is that actually one of the things the council has clearly realised is that it's quite useful for these kind of citizen-led approaches. I've been very explicitly calling this like a fourth estate approach. So it's part of the civic structure of Sheffield. It's part of the constitution of Sheffield, in my head, what we are doing. We as Sheffield citizens are creating this map, and we're not trying to foist it on the government. I mean, it would be good if the government, I think, legitimised it, but we're really actually just encouraging them to see, well, this is an independent structure. You've got nothing to be threatened by it. And actually, you could use it. We'll work with you to share the outputs and use it so you can better connect with communities, even if we don't give it a formal status. The next stage for us, we started this in this project, but we haven't really used this data yet, is to actually start to generate new kinds of maps that work on a neighborhood basis. Clearly, one of the interesting things you can do is, and we have already done some of this, and you can see some of this online, is you can take existing data and then show how that data relates to a particular neighborhood. So you can start to help neighborhoods develop a better understanding of what's going on for that neighborhood. You can also use this, again, which I don't think people think about hard enough, and it relates to the earlier point. You can use this approach to show neighborhoods how other neighborhoods are doing things. So one of the things we need to explore more is kind of networked learning and start to get people to think about how the fact that one other neighborhood is doing something well, doing something interesting, is actually just an opportunity for learning by your neighborhood. You could take that idea, share that idea, adapt that idea to your context. And now for us, the next project is using a little bit of control shift funding that we received, is we're going to now work with People First Group Doncaster to use this tool as part of our strategy to grow flourishing neighborhoods. We've decided to actually focus on the community of intake. That's a place in Doncaster where PFG have taken over something called the Wellness Centre. PFG has 3,500 members, but 200 of them are in intake. And we're going to use that to work to define a kind of model neighbourhood. So what should citizens be doing? How should that be organised? What should public services be doing? How should that be organised? How can this is a very disadvantaged neighbourhood in Doncaster. How can it get a fair deal from the system? What is the appropriate democratic decision-making structures that we might want to grow in and around these ideas? But as we do this, the output of the survey tool itself will give us an opportunity to actually allow all the other neighbourhoods, the 147, plus there are 88 neighbourhoods in Doncaster that are well defined. So we'll have a kind of a least test bed of 250 neighbourhoods where the people might be people interested in using the same survey. The underlying assumption that I'm making, sorry, this slide's got far too much information on it, but is that actually what we're saying to allies in civil society and the public sector is we need to rethink our relationship with neighborhoods. We need to think of neighborhoods as the topsoil of community life. We need to start, we need to stop extracting value from neighborhoods. So, for instance, in adult social care, more than half of the funding is spent taking people out of their neighborhood and placing them in residential care. So, if you start to think about that as an economic action, it's incredibly extractive. That's billions and billions of pounds in England that's extracted from neighborhoods. So we need to start thinking differently about the relationships between all of these different things, a different kind of priority story, really. We are in conversation with the four cities of South Yorkshire and the ICB to start thinking about whether this approach to a kind of neighbourhood care could become the model for South Yorkshire. And this is just some of the underlying thinking that drives this, which is that ultimately what's happened is that we've created a series of problems for ourselves by failing to solve problems in the right place. That what's happening is resource and attention is going downstream into institutional responses and service responses, not going upstream towards thinking about citizenship, family, community, social justice, and our relationship with nature. I'm going to end the